The rain poured down in unrelenting sheets as Emily Preston clutched her worn leather satchel close to her chest, shielding it from the deluge. Her trembling hands barely held onto the umbrella, a cheap find from the corner store that flipped with every gust of wind. Her heels splashed through puddles as she hurried toward the towering glass skyscraper ahead. The words Dalton Enterprises glistened in silver above the revolving doors, and her heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance. After months of fruitless applications and mounting bills, Emily had landed an interview for a coveted assistant position at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. She hadn't eaten much in the past 2 days, scrimping on meals to afford a second-hand blazer, and skirt that, though slightly too big, gave her the appearance of professionalism. She stepped inside, shaking off the rain, and was immediately struck by the grandeur of the lobby. Marble floors gleamed under modern chandeliers, and sharp-dressed professionals moved with purpose. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive coffee, a far cry from the cramped, drafty apartment she called home. Emily felt out of place but squared her shoulders, reminding herself why she was here. Her focus was so intent on not slipping as she crossed the shiny floors that she nearly walked straight into a man. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, with a presence that commanded the space. His jet-black hair was slightly tousled, and his piercing grey eyes seemed to see right through her. A faint, intrigued smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he caught her gaze. "Are you all right?" His voice was rich with a hint of amusement. Emily blinked, realizing she had been staring. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm fine. Just the rain." She gestured vaguely to her dripping umbrella, mortified. "Good to hear." He stepped aside with an elegance that made her acutely aware of her soaked shoes squeaking against the floor. "You're here for the interviews, aren't you?" She nodded, unsure of how he could possibly know. "Good luck," he said simply, his smile deepening before he turned and walked toward the elevator bank. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him before, but there was no time to dwell. She checked in at the front desk, received directions to the 30th floor, and took a steadying breath before heading to the elevators. As she rode up, Emily mentally rehearsed her answers to potential interview questions. Her qualifications were modest but honest, her experience as a waitress and part-time data clerk at a small firm providing just enough to fill a single page on her resume. Still, she promised herself she would try her best. This job could change everything. The office on the 30th floor was just as intimidating as the lobby. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the city, and the receptionist, an impeccably dressed woman with a sharp bob, directed her to wait in a plush seating area. Other candidates sat nearby, all in sleek outfits and exuding confidence. Emily felt small but refused to let it show. When her name was finally called, her pulse quickened. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and followed the receptionist into a spacious conference room. To her surprise, the man from the lobby sat at the head of the long table, flanked by 2 other executives. His presence was even more commanding in this formal setting. "Miss Preston, please have a seat," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Emily did as instructed, trying to steady her breathing. He leaned forward, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. The interview began with standard questions, her background, her skills, her availability. But as it progressed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the man's interest went beyond her answers. He introduced himself as Adrian Dalton, CEO of the company, and every word he spoke carried weight. His questions were probing but fair, his tone thoughtful. "And what motivates you, Miss Preston?" Adrian asked, his gaze never leaving hers. Emily hesitated, but only briefly. "I've always believed in hard work and resilience," she said. "No matter how difficult things get, I want to prove that I can succeed, not just for myself, but for the people who have supported me along the way." Adrian's expression softened, though he said nothing for a moment. When he finally spoke, there was a new warmth in his tone. "That's admirable." The rest of the interview flew by, and as Emily stood to leave, Adrian offered her a hand. His touch was firm yet gentle, and for a moment their eyes met again. Emily felt something she couldn't quite place, a spark, a connection, something deeper than mere professional courtesy. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. Adrian nodded. "We'll be in touch soon." As Emily stepped out into the hallway, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The elevator ride down felt surreal, her thoughts a jumble of nervousness and a strange, inexplicable thrill. She had no idea that the simple act of walking into that interview would change her life forever. Far above, in the conference room, Adrian Dalton remained seated, his mind unusually preoccupied. His colleagues began to discuss the candidates, but his thoughts lingered on the determined young woman with rain-soaked shoes and fire in her eyes. "She's interesting," he murmured to himself, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Little did she know Emily Preston had already captured far more than his professional attention. The next morning, Emily awoke to a sharp knock on her apartment door. Her tiny studio smelled faintly of instant coffee and damp fabric, a far cry from the polished grandeur of Dalton Enterprises. She stumbled to open the door, only to find her landlord, a gruff man with a perpetual scowl. "Rent's late," he barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Emily swallowed hard. "I just need a little more time, Mr. Carter. I have an interview result coming soon. If I get the job, I'll—" "No promises," he interrupted. "I want payment by Friday or you're out." The door slammed shut before she could respond. Emily sighed, her brief flicker of optimism dimmed by the harsh reality she faced daily, but she refused to let it break her spirit. She grabbed her phone, hoping for an email or a call from Dalton Enterprises. Nothing yet. Determined not to let despair win, she spent the day cleaning tables at the diner where she still picked up shifts, keeping herself busy to avoid spiraling. By the time she dragged herself home, exhaustion pressed heavy on her shoulders. She had just set her bag down when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "Miss Preston? This is Adrian Dalton." His smooth, familiar voice sent a jolt through her. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Emily froze, the world narrowing to the sound of his words. "No, not at all. It's a good time. I wanted to personally inform you that you've been selected for the position. Congratulations." Relief and disbelief washed over her in equal measure. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I don't know what to say. You've earned it. And please, call me Adrian," he said, a smile evident in his tone. "Report to the office Monday morning. HR will provide you with all the details." The call ended, but Emily stayed rooted in place, her mind spinning. She had done it. This job could be the lifeline she desperately needed, yet beneath her triumph there was a strange fluttering in her chest at the thought of Adrian. She shook her head, chastising herself. He was her boss now, that's all. Monday morning came swiftly, and Emily arrived early, her nerves coiled tight. She was greeted by the HR manager, who walked her through her duties, and by mid-morning she was already immersed in a whirlwind of schedules, phone calls, and administrative tasks. Adrian, meanwhile, remained a distant but magnetic presence. His office, encased in glass, loomed at the center of the floor. Emily occasionally caught glimpses of him, focused and commanding, as he led meetings or spoke with other executives. To her surprise, he stopped by her desk around noon. "How's your first day going?" Adrian asked, his voice warm. Emily straightened in her chair. "It's busy but good. Thank you again for the opportunity." "I had no doubts about your potential," he replied. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know." For the next week, Emily threw herself into her work. She proved herself efficient and resourceful, even earning praise from her direct supervisor. Still, Adrian's attention didn't go unnoticed. While he remained professional, there was a subtle but undeniable connection every time their paths crossed. A shared glance, a brief smile. By Friday, however, that connection became more evident. Emily had stayed late to finalize a report when Adrian appeared at her desk, his suit jacket draped over one arm. "You work harder than most people here," he said, his tone light. Emily smiled shyly. "I'm just trying to keep up." Adrian paused, his eyes softening. "You're doing more than that. Would you join me for dinner? I'd like to discuss your progress." Emily's heart skipped. She hesitated, unsure if this crossed a line, but Adrian added quickly, "Strictly professional, of course." She nodded. "All right, thank you." That evening, they met at an upscale restaurant not far from the office. Emily had never been anywhere so lavish, and Adrian seemed to notice her awe. "It's just a place," he said, holding out her chair for her. "What matters is the company." Their conversation began with work, her goals, ideas for streamlining processes, but soon turned personal. Adrian spoke about his journey to becoming CEO, the sacrifices, and the loneliness of success. Emily, in turn, opened up about her struggles, her late parents, and the burden of trying to stay afloat. "I admire your resilience," Adrian said, his voice low. "It's rare to meet someone with such drive." Emily felt a warmth spreading through her, but she quickly reminded herself of the boundaries. Still, as the evening wore on, the line between professionalism and something more blurred. Adrian's gaze lingered, his words more intimate, until a silence settled between them. "Emily," he began, his tone hesitant yet firm, "there's something about you that draws me in. I've never—" She stood abruptly, her heart pounding. "I should go. Thank you for dinner." Adrian didn't stop her, though his eyes spoke volumes. As Emily walked away, her emotions were a storm of confusion and longing. The days following their dinner blurred into a strange dance of avoidance and unspoken tension. Emily buried herself in her work, determined to prove that she deserved her position on merit alone. Adrian, on the other hand, seemed more reserved, almost as though he were giving her space. Yet their paths continued to cross, each encounter charged with a quiet electricity. On Wednesday morning, Emily arrived at the office early, eager to get a head start on a new project. As she approached her desk, she noticed a small envelope resting atop her keyboard. Her name was written in bold, precise handwriting. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside was a single note: "Meet me on the rooftop at noon. Adrian." Her stomach flipped, a mix of anticipation and dread. What could he possibly want? She debated ignoring it altogether, but found herself unable to focus as the hours crept by. When noon arrived, she stood and made her way to the elevator, her pulse quickening with each floor. The rooftop was a hidden gem, an oasis of greenery and quiet high above the bustling city. Adrian stood near the edge, his hands in his pockets as he gazed out over the skyline. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression softening. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. Emily crossed her arms, trying to mask her nervousness. "You asked me to." "I did," Adrian admitted, stepping closer. "I wanted to apologize if I made you uncomfortable the other night. That was never my intention." Emily relaxed slightly but remained guarded. "It's fine, I just wasn't sure what to think." Adrian nodded, his gaze earnest. "I respect you, Emily, both as an employee and as a person. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something more. That's why I've been careful, trying not to overstep." His confession left her speechless. She had sensed his interest, but hearing it aloud was another matter entirely. Her emotions were a whirlwind of excitement, fear, and disbelief. "Adrian, you're my boss," she said finally. Whatever this is, it's complicated." "I know," he said, his voice low, "and I don't want to put you in an impossible position. I just needed to be honest with you." The vulnerability in his tone caught her off guard. Adrian Dalton, the powerful CEO who commanded rooms with ease, was standing before her, laying his feelings bare. Before she could respond, a sharp ring cut through the moment. Adrian pulled his phone from his pocket, his jaw tightening as he read the screen. "I have to take this," he said, stepping away. "But think about what I said. Please." The rest of the week passed in a blur. Emily couldn't stop replaying their rooftop conversation in her mind. Adrian had been nothing but professional during office hours, yet she couldn't ignore the way her heart leapt whenever their eyes met. She hated how much she wanted to see him again outside of work, how the idea of more scared her as much as it thrilled her. By Friday, her turmoil reached a breaking point. That evening, she stayed late to finish a report, hoping the solitude of the empty office would help clear her head. As she worked, the elevator doors chimed, and to her surprise, Adrian stepped out. "Still here?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. "Just wrapping up," Emily replied, keeping her eyes on her computer screen. Adrian lingered by her desk, his presence impossible to ignore. "Would you join me for a walk? The night air might do you good." She hesitated but eventually nodded. Together they rode the elevator down and stepped onto the quiet city streets. The tension between them was palpable, but Adrian made no move to broach the subject of their earlier conversation. Instead, he spoke about the company's upcoming projects, the challenges they faced, and his hopes for the future. It was only when they reached a small park that he finally turned to her. "I meant what I said, Emily. I want to know you, not just as an employee, but as the incredible person you are." Emily felt her defenses cracking. "Adrian, this isn't easy for me. My whole life has been a struggle to prove that I can stand on my own 2 feet. Getting involved with you wouldn't take that away," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. You're strong, Emily. Stronger than you realize. I admire that about you. Her resolve wavered, and before she could stop herself, she asked, "Why me? You could have anyone." Adrian's expression softened. "Because you're real, genuine. You don't try to impress anyone, and yet you do, simply by being yourself." The sincerity in his words broke through her last wall of doubt. Without thinking, she stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. Adrian hesitated only a moment before reaching out, his hand brushing hers. The touch sent a spark through her, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope. Their connection deepened in the weeks that followed, though they kept their relationship discreet. Adrian respected Emily's boundaries, never pushing her beyond what she was comfortable with. Their stolen moments, though fleeting, became the highlight of her days. But not everyone was blind to the growing bond between them. One morning during a meeting, a senior executive named Victoria Ames, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper instincts, made a pointed comment. "Emily," she said with a smirk, "you've certainly caught the CEO's attention. Must be nice to have such strong support." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Emily. Her cheeks burned. But before she could respond, Adrian spoke. "Miss Ames," he said coolly, "if you have something to say about my decisions, I suggest you do so directly. Otherwise, I expect you to maintain professionalism." Victoria's smirk faded, and the meeting continued. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. That afternoon, Adrian found her in the break room. "Are you all right?" he asked, his concern evident. "I'm fine," she lied. "But I'm worried about how this looks. People are starting to notice." Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Let them talk. What matters is how we handle this, together." Emily wanted to believe him, but the weight of their secret began to wear on her. As much as she cared for Adrian, she couldn't ignore the risk to her career or to his reputation. The breaking point came during a gala for Dalton Enterprises, a glittering affair attended by the city's elite. Emily had been invited as part of the administrative team, and though she felt out of place in her modest evening dress, Adrian's quiet encouragement had convinced her to attend. The night was a whirlwind of introductions and small talk, but Emily couldn't ignore the whispers and sidelong glances directed her way. By the time the evening wound down, she felt suffocated. Adrian found her near the exit, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. "I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't belong in your world, Adrian, and I don't want to be the reason people doubt you." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You're not. Don't let their opinions define us." But Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I need time to think." Without waiting for his response, she slipped out into the night, leaving Adrian standing alone in the glittering ballroom. The days following the gala were the longest of Emily's life. She poured herself into her work, avoiding Adrian whenever possible. Her heart ached with the weight of her decision, but she convinced herself it was for the best. Being with him meant walking a tightrope, constantly balancing between her growing love for him and the risk of ruining everything they had built individually. Adrian respected her space, though his presence loomed large. He didn't send notes or arrange secret meetings, he simply waited. Yet Emily could feel his eyes on her during staff meetings, or when they passed each other in the halls, his gaze filled with emotions she couldn't bear to face. One rainy evening, as Emily packed up her things, she received a text message from an unknown number. "Come to the rooftop, please." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew who it was, and despite her better judgment, she found herself riding the elevator to the top floor. When she stepped out into the cool night air, Adrian was there, waiting. His hair was damp from the drizzle, his suit jacket draped carelessly over the railing. The city stretched out behind him, a sea of twinkling lights that seemed impossibly far away. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said softly. Emily crossed her arms, trying to guard herself. "What do you want, Adrian?" He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "To fix this. To fix us." "There is no us," she replied, her voice trembling. "We can't—" "Why not?" he interrupted, his tone more forceful than she'd ever heard. "Because of what people think? Because of some arbitrary rules? I don't care about any of that, Emily. All I care about is you." His words hit her like a tidal wave. She wanted to believe him, to give in to the feelings she had been suppressing, but doubt still gnawed at her. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian stepped even closer, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the chill in the air. "It is," he insisted. "I know this is scary, but nothing worth having comes without risk. I'm willing to fight for this. For us. Are you?" Emily's heart pounded as she searched his face for any hint of insincerity. All she saw was raw, unguarded truth. Slowly she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Adrian reached out, brushing them away with a tenderness that made her knees weak. In that moment, the walls she had so carefully built around her heart crumbled. Adrian cupped her face in his hands and leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was both gentle and overwhelming. Emily melted into him, her doubts dissolving as she clung to him like a lifeline. The days that followed felt like a dream. Emily and Adrian's relationship flourished, no longer hidden in the shadows. They navigated the challenges together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Adrian's support gave Emily the confidence to push boundaries at work, and her ideas began to earn recognition from senior management. But not everyone was happy about their newfound happiness. Victoria Ames, the sharp-tongued executive who had once made a pointed remark about Emily, grew increasingly hostile. She began questioning Emily's decisions in meetings, her tone dripping with condescension. One afternoon, during a particularly tense strategy session, Victoria crossed a line. "It's clear Miss Preston's priorities lie elsewhere," she said, her voice laced with venom. "Perhaps she should focus less on extracurricular activities and more on her job." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Adrian. His expression darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was like ice. "Miss Ames, your comments are not only inappropriate, but unprofessional. If you have concerns about our strategy, address them constructively. Personal attacks will not be tolerated." Victoria's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing more. Emily, though shaken, felt a surge of gratitude and pride. Adrian's unwavering support reassured her that they could weather any storm together. Their relationship faced its greatest test a month later. Dalton Enterprises was in the middle of a major merger, and tensions were high. Adrian was under immense pressure, working late into the night and often skipping meals. Emily did her best to support him, but the stress began to take its toll. One evening, as they sat in Adrian's office reviewing documents, he suddenly stood, swaying slightly. Emily rushed to his side. "Adrian, you need to rest," she said, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," he insisted, though his pale complexion said otherwise. "No, you're not," Emily shot back. "You're running yourself into the ground. Let me help." Adrian sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I hate feeling weak." "You're not weak," Emily said firmly. "You're human. Let me take care of you for once." Reluctantly, Adrian allowed her to guide him to the couch in his office. She fetched a blanket from the supply closet and stayed by his side, holding his hand as he finally allowed himself to rest. In that quiet moment, Emily realized just how deeply she cared for him, not as her CEO, but as the man she loved. The merger was ultimately a success, and with it came a sense of stability. Adrian, having learned to lean on Emily, began to delegate more, allowing himself to enjoy life outside of work. Their relationship, though still the subject of occasional gossip, became an accepted part of the office dynamic. On a sunny Saturday morning, Adrian surprised Emily with a trip to the countryside. They drove for hours, leaving the city behind until they reached a charming inn nestled in a valley. Emily was enchanted by the peaceful surroundings, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of birdsong. That evening, as they walked through a field bathed in the golden light of sunset, Adrian stopped suddenly. He turned to Emily, his expression both nervous and determined. "There's something I've been wanting to say," he began, taking her hands in his. "Emily, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me what it means to truly love and be loved. I don't want to spend another day without you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "1,000 times yes." Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a kiss that sealed their promise. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Emily felt a sense of peace and joy she had never known. Their journey had been anything but easy, but it had brought them to this moment, a beginning filled with hope, love, and endless possibilities. In the months that followed, Emily and Adrian planned a small, intimate wedding surrounded by their closest friends and family. The ceremony was held in the same countryside inn where Adrian had proposed, the field now adorned with flowers and fairy lights. As they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Their life together was far from perfect. There were challenges, arguments, and moments of doubt. But through it all, they remained steadfast, their love a constant anchor in the storm. Years later, as they stood together on the rooftop where it all began, Emily looked out over the city and smiled. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. Adrian wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day," he replied, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, Emily realized that the risk she had taken, the leap of faith into the unknown, had led her to a life she could have never imagined. It wasn't just a love story. It was the story of two people who dared to defy the odds and found happiness in the process.